welcome to our Health Humanities portrait. The current title is Identity at the Intersection of Gender, Religion, Ethnicity, and Mental Health Among Mexican Women in Chicago. And thank you for being patient. That might be presumptuous. I don't know if you were patient, but thank you for hanging with us among the changes and the lateness and working things out. We had a particularly challenging group in terms of our schedules completely not working together. And then we spent a long time trying to find the first person narrative that we wanted to use that would illuminate the issues that we wanted to discuss and that we were that would get this at the social theme that we wanted to get to. So we had some challenges. I'll just put it that. But here we are. And
I just want to add that I think that we want to mention that because I think that it speaks to the lack of literature out there on the Mexican American female experience, and the fact that we have like such a huge pile and we couldn't really find a good first person narrative. I think it's important to keep in mind, and it kind of to us, I don't know why it's kind of reiterated to us the importance actually of this work, and for me as a researcher really inspired me to continue to do this kind of work. And so what we're gonna, the portrait, the narrative is actually one that we did ourselves because we couldn't find one. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that evolved.
Yes. And thank you to Gretchen for mentoring us along the way and helping us with this search. Joanna conducted interviews. These are our interviews just for the purposes of our portrait, so they're fresh. And also there was a lot of research going into this. So the teaching guide is a work in process. Our discussion, our PowerPoint, everything today is a work in progress. But I think we've got an overall structure. We have some activities that we are wondering about whether to use or not to use, but we can discuss that in the second half. So we'll go through what our plan is for today. So our learning objectives, we were using the performance studies analytic, and so we decided to use the concept of identity as a performance because the interviews that Joanna conducted, it really lent itself to pulling out what some of the key themes were by using the concept of that identity as something that's performed. We're going to explore how individuals are expected to perform cultural roles based on their gender, religion, and ethnicity. Of course, there are other vectors of intersectionality, but these are the ones that we're focusing on for this portrait. Here we go. This is good to use that one. Okay. Thank you. You're performing assistive technology.
I studied it.
We want to consider how expected cultural roles may affect an individual's experience of illness and analyze how these roles may affect patients' understanding of and engagement with the healthcare system. So through this dramaturgical analysis of how we perform our roles and how our roles may come into conflict with expectations and changing in generations and cultures clashing, that sort of thing. And so as our example, we're going to explore Mexican American women and how their expected gender roles of Marianismo and Machismo relate to mental health treatment. We're going to look at how these gender role performances take place within a socioeconomic and religious setting. And then we have this suggested activity that we may just describe to you and see how it might work when we actually teach this for a group, but we wanted to present to you what that activity was at the end. So our plan for today is I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about identity as performance so that you can have it in your mind as we get to the analysis. And then Elsa is going to give us some helpful language and definitions. This was a struggle for us because we weren't sure whether we should use Latinx, Latina, Hispanic. And so Elsa laid some options out for us, but then we also had to make a decision about what we're going to use for this session and an explanation of why we made that choice. It was even difficult to talk amongst ourselves when
that became almost part of the portrait itself, is a distinction and understanding.
Right, so she's going to lay that out for us. This kind of reminds us of the pronoun conversation we had last time. She's going to lay out some important statistics related to the community and some of what the mental health issues are in Hispanic communities. Then Joanna will be providing us the setting of the context of the interviews that are related to the Little Village Research Project. And then we pulled out some sections of the interviews for us to look at together through some of the guiding questions that I will provide before we get to that section. And we'll be leading those discussions together. And then Joanna will talk about the cultural elicitation framework and our ideas. So the performance of identity was first formulated by sociologist Irving Goffman in his 1959 book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. This is taken up by sociologists, it's taken up by theater, taken up by performance studies folks. And he used theater practice as a metaphor for social interaction. So this is also called the dramaturgical model. And that he talks about how people as individuals are actors who play a variety of roles. So he takes the theatrical practice. This is something, as an aside, I feel obliged to say that theater people have a lot of quibbles with Goffman using our art form as a metaphor, since he doesn't have a deep understanding of our art form. But I'm going to be a performance studies person now and taking this. We're using Goffman in this way, so that you can think about, people taking on roles of identity. That we play our roles in order to manage impressions, and that primarily in social settings, each person is trying to figure out how to enact their role. He says to prevent embarrassment of self and to prevent other people from becoming embarrassed. It's like a negotiation of roles to try to make to try to define the situation. So each person in these interactions tries to ensure that they all have the same definition. And I think when we get to the interviews, you'll see this happening as the women start talking about how they're performing for their husbands, for their children, for their doctors. You'll see this play out. So in this impression management interaction, that performing these social roles help us figure out what is meant to happen in a situation. So right now I'm playing the role of facilitator and you're playing the role of students. So if we were to change up what is expected, it would then cause us a whole nother set of interactions to negotiate what that role, how those things are going to shift. So it helps manage what the expectations are from everyone involved, how one should behave, and that these performances create meaning, and they also confirm the identities of those who are involved. So right now you're sitting and you're nodding as I speak, which is a nice confirmation that you are listening to me as a facilitator. You taking me seriously. And this is not something that always happens. Like when I walk into my classroom on the first day, they never think the disabled person's the professor. And I have to establish those words. So you have to establish your role. And we see the women in these interviews kind of working on trying to establish their authority of who they are and their identities. It confirms status, gender, occupation, age, any of those factors. Now, individuals may or may not be conscious of performing their roles. It's something that we take on as a performance of everyday life, but there are times when we become very conscious. And the women in the interviews, there will be moments when they highlight how they're expected to behave and how they have to behave in a certain way to navigate their social environment. So the elements that, some vocabulary that I thought would be helpful for us to use that I pulled from Goffman is these, that we can talk about the front stage, and that it would be, if you were watching a theatrical performance, the stage where the actors are in front of the audience, and that the actors are always adjusting their performance to how the audience is performing their role as audience, ideally, which is why it's not a movie. So that as the audience is giving feedback to the performer is adjusting for the audience, and you're adjusting expectations all along. Then there's the backstage, where actors can be themselves, and they're still playing a role, but they're playing a more private version of themselves, so away from the audience. And you're going to see front stage and backstage in the interviews as well. That we could talk about the setting, and we'll be showing you some examples. We'll be showing you some photographs. Joanna will be talking about the context of the interviews. But we could talk about scenery, props, location. We can talk about appearance, so costume, or how someone is dressed, or how they may wear their makeup or their hair. And then Goffman uses the term manner, where there's an expectation that someone will be either consistent or inconsistent with their role. So as you're seeing inconsistencies, that's a place where meaning can shift and change. So how are these women that in the interviews will be looking at, how are they performing consistently with the expectations, and how are they performing inconsistently? And this is something they really get to in these interviews. And then front. The front is the script. And so the expected social interactions always, according to Goffman, follow some sort of script, almost all situations. You may not know the script exactly, but you know basically how to perform it. And that there are stereotyped expectations, and how that front gets negotiated in real time between actors and audience is part of that dynamic. So that's the framework. Now we'll move to Elsa, who's going to provide us some of that context with definitions and statistics.
So during our discussion, thank you. During our discussion, actually, we had a lot of conversation about what Latin. There was a lot of emails that sent Latinx, and then I had to say how I feel about the word Latinx. But first, I want to make sure that we understand where the term comes from. So Latin is actually a language, and that's where it derived from all like French, Italian, Spanish, Romanian, Portuguese, and maybe another one that I might forgetting right now. So Latin America, it actually only encompasses Spanish and Portuguese, so Brazil and all Spanish-speaking countries. It doesn't include Haiti or Belize. So that is what makes Latin. So Latin, so that is the concept of Latin America. So the Latin, actually, in Spanish, everything is very dual. There's binary. It's always going to be A or O. So I'm always keeping, for example, trying to keep a very inclusive language in my house, because I have 3 boys and 1 girl, and there's no way that I can do that, because everything is very like he or she. So Latino or Latina is actually what the main top for us in Spanish. What would that mean? I'm Latina. But then the vowel for Latin actually was dropped actually in the 1980s, and then in the early 2000s, X was added to create a more inclusive environment into the LGBTQ non-conforming, gender-conforming populations. As a Spanish-speaking person, I struggle with that term because it doesn't follow any grammar rules. So Latinx, even though it's inclusive within the U.S. population, doesn't make a lot of sense for us, if that makes sense. So Hispanic is everybody who's actually came from Spanish-speaking country and derived from Spain and so on. So we feel that, and there was actually a Pew research that was done several years ago that showed that actually we really don't care, like Hispanic, we really don't care how we call Latino, Latina, Latinx, Hispanic. We do prefer Hispanic as a main verb, let's say, as an ethnicity. So And something to I also want to say too is that the Real Academia Española, which is the main driver of Spanish, the language itself, actually refused to have X as a vowel. So basically, this is actually consonant. So so I was. So that's why, when I try calling my kids, chicos, chicas, niños, niñas, there's not really any way that I can call them in another way.
And I just add, I think it's just important to know it's not just like all words in the Spanish language are either or o, and so it's a grammar thing, not so much a feminine masculine thing. And so I think I've heard from some of my friends that say, the X is actually taking away that's not our native language is always about ending in O or A, and so there is a sense of Americanization happening with the language that some people found offensive. And so we just wanted to provide all of the perspectives on that and clarify some of people's different viewpoints.
And I would say that it's offensive. It's just like, kind of, if that makes sense. I just cringe. Yeah, I cringe when I see the words like that. But we're open to actually make sure everybody. Some people may argue that the Hispanic community might be some homophobia to there as an argument to provide that argument. And it's true. It's true in every culture, I would say. But there's a lot of work that is being done and progress that's been done in that regard. Something to keep in mind too, 60% actually, Hispanic consists of 20% of the U.S. population, and 60% of them are Mexican, of Mexican origin. Everybody else is Puerto Rican, Central America, South America, and Cuban. And the largest concentrations are, California, Texas, Arizona, Florida, Illinois, and New York. Sorry, that's covered. Something to keep in mind. Something to keep in mind too is that in Hispanic community, 60% or more speak Spanish in their house. So that is also very valuable to keep in mind when we're discussing communication with our patients, because Spanish is still the main language spoken at home. And the U.S. population has continued to diversify, and then you can actually see from this chart like this, because 62% right now is white and 18% is Hispanic. And most of them actually are coming from South America, Central America. And what happened is that the population actually, as the baby boomers, they start, they die eventually. We all gonna die. So the Hispanic population, for some reason, continues to grow, and that's why probably one of the things that is driving the nationalist conversation on the other side, on politics and on social media, mostly because the white population is increasing as we're now having more kids as they used to with the baby boomers. So that is actually predicting how we're going to practice medicine in the future. Mental health, there's a lot of stigma in the Hispanic community. It's actually is seen as a sign of weakness, but there's a lot of general anxiety, depression, PTSD. Suicide is actually seen in second and third generations in our communities, and no one is actually going to talk about it. And most of the time, actually, they will deny it, and we'll talk a little more about that. They will describe it as differently. There's a stigma. It's something that we don't talk outside. We always say that la ropa sucia se lava en casa. Even our neighbors or our families will not know what is going within our own lives. So we're very, very private in that regard. Language barriers is also very hard. Is another barrier that Hispanic encounter, and some actually inability to actually express how we feel right now, like how I'm struggling right now. So you can actually see that there's a lot of communication barriers that happens in the Hispanic community. 30 to 40% don't have insurance or have inadequate insurance, and then when they have legal status, immigration status, actually that will make it very hard for them to find Something also that happens too is that how we describe, sometimes, oh, I have problem with my nervousness, but it's actually more anxiety. Sometimes they're actually going to say, oh, I'm fatigued, I feel drained. I'm just very, very tired. Just very non-specific terms, but they will never use mental health as the way to actually express how they feel. And it's always gonna be a physical ailment. And they don't like taking medication, and psychotherapy is more acceptable. Counseling, they actually look for a lot of help, especially within the church, pastor or priest community. And they tend to use a lot of natural medicine, so there's always a tea for something, and that will help to heal something else. And they also do a lot of prayers, a lot of they said sobo is like a lot of rubbing too that happens, a lot of massage therapy, accompanied with prayers, and that also for pains and aches and broken bones and everything. But faith takes a very strong role in spirituality. They usually, when they're sad, they look for God as a way to actually cope with what they're going through. Okay, so you got one. Oh.
Just turn that one off,
Yeah.
so there's not feedback.
Okay, so in terms of setting, these interviews, I conducted these interviews in Spanish with 3 women from the Little Village neighborhood. And this actually was part of a larger situation that I wanted to share with you guys, because I think it's important to understand the context in the way that mental health was surfaced in the community as one of the predominant issues of Little Village. And so these women, all of these women, had participated in a community health needs assessment that was in collaboration with the city of Chicago. And so before I get into that, though, in terms of the population of Little Village itself is majority Latino, Hispanic, majority Mexican, and these numbers coincide with some of the national data in terms of lack of health insurance and not speaking the language. And so the community organization Tepozcalia has been in, which is where the interviews were conducted, has been in the community for over 15 years. And so the city of Chicago and researchers in the School of Public Health approached them and said, we really want a more collaborative way of understanding what your real concerns are. The residents had said that the hospital-based community health needs assessments are not reflective of their community at all, and that after the first 15 of the 100 survey questionnaire, they basically just fill it out for the gift card, and that those types of hospital level assessments don't effectively really get at the problems in the community. And that the questions themselves do not actually reflect the needs, but even more importantly, the strengths of what Little Village has to offer that positively impacts their lived reality. And so they actually feel that written surveys and writing things down in general creates a power imbalance, and that it's actually a failure of an inequitable healthcare system to come to them with our method of assessing their needs in writing with surveys. And so this was an approach to flip that switch and make it responsive to how the community understands their own needs and explores that. And so what this was, what this community did is they started the session with a bunch of photographs that would elicit individuals' own personal experience. And so it could be anywhere from marigold or flor de muerto, which is a very, has a ceremonial significance and even medicinal significance in the Mexican American community, Day of the Dead, artistry, somebody making tortillas, or even just a ranch, and would ask folks with those pictures to sit down and say, what did this bring up for you? And it ended up being a series, it was a group discussion utilizing these photos to elicit individuals' own experiences. And so these pictures were part of 7 focus groups done with, it ended up that only women showed up for them, which is a whole thing to contemplate on itself. And so they would ask, why did you choose this image and what thoughts emerged? And they did this while they were also eating together, and so sharing food in pretty basically any culture is a part of sharing ideas and thoughts and experiences. And so this idea of eating together, sharing food, and talking about these photos, these groups evolved into what they're calling healing circles. And so what happened was that a lot of the women that I interviewed mentioned that there were issues that they did not even understand was really a mental health concern or what have you, but in the conversation, other women would elicit experiences that they felt violated or something that they felt was a problem, and it helped other people recognize these things as well. And so, so some of the results that the research project, which is ongoing, saying that we are not, this idea that they're constantly looked at as a problem, and that they want to be referred to in a different way. And that mental health actually was the outcome of all of these focus groups that the Little Village, in addition to the Carrillo article, which is a larger research study, this is a piece of that showing that mental health is really the largest problem, even though it's not referred to in the same way, and that discrimination has contributed to that in terms of their being in the United States, but that also self-care and remedies are things that they utilize to treat it, and that the idea of an integration of their cultural roots and traditions are really important for them to maintain their own sense of well-being and mental health in a community in the United States. And so there was a call for more community-based research that basically doesn't just mean going out in the community and doing interviews. Obviously, we all know that, but I'm learning a lot of other people don't realize that community-based really means community directs. And you respond and come up with themes and direction based on their needs and not the other way around. And that there needs to be more community and culturally appropriate methods to address mental health, which I think the Carrillo article also underscores. And so that's just what I wanted to mention in terms of these women being part of these larger, they're in this small circle and these larger circles of studies that have been ongoing and happening in the Little Village neighborhood for a while now.
So Joanna just went through the setting, and now we wanted to set up what some of those gendered scripts and expectations are, and that came from the Maria Paradox book. And so now we'll just kind of set out what are some of the expectations, and then we'll move us into the next stage.
This is very interesting because this is the main, it's a topic that is dear to my heart. I didn't understand that until this dualism that was so strong in my upbringings that that's the main reason why I left my hometown. So I was a single mom, and I was, even though no one actively rejected me, there's a lot of also that happens in the Hispanic community is that they're not very direct. They will never tell you something's right or wrong, but they will actually do it with nonverbal communication. So, and that really speaks for itself, and it's very, and even though people will seem to support you, you know that the nonverbal is telling you otherwise. So when I moved to Peoria 15 years ago, this was the reason, actually. It was very strong. And I feel rejected. And I said, well, if someone is going to reject, they might as well reject me for who I am. Because doesn't know who I am? No, because I'm part of this culture. So Marianismo is actually this submissive type of woman, that expectation that you have to be at home, raise children, you self-sacrifice yourself for the needs of your family and the community. You never talk about sex. There's expectation that you actually have to be, it's only for the purpose of procreation. Women should not have fun or enjoy that privacy, the act of sex. It's also that is a submission to men and a patriarchal role. And then you're responsible not only for the children, but for the well-being of everybody in the house. And then you always should also say the bigger piece of meat to your husband or the main person, male in the family. And and it's emotionally expressive, but then it's wrong when you express your emotions. You're always being judged by how you express your emotion. You have to be this figure that, and it's expectation that you never show who you are to everybody else. You're always performing in that regard. Machismo, so there's two types of for the male. So there's going to be the caballero or the machismo. Machismo is the extreme. You know, they tend to be protector, provider. They tend to be very strong-willed. They know what they want. They emotionally reserved. They actually have permission to actually have the sexual license and go and have an affair. And then the woman actually needs to wait at home and not say anything about it. They tend to be very dominant. They're not very engaged with their family and children and their wife. And then they have more options for like choices. They can actually go and they're never judged by what decisions they make. They're actually always being excused by their own behaviors and never seen as wrong. So caballero is actually more like a more decent, more decent, more caring male version of the machismo, but it still has that power difference with the women as well.
So keeping the setting and the expected gender roles in mind, as we're going through the excerpts, think about who are the actors, in the stories that the women are telling, and also in the material that you read the longer interviews. Who's the audience? So we could also think about the focus group and in the situations they describe. What are the settings they describe? What are the expected roles? And what are the women's conflicting role expectations front stage and backstage? Because there's a lot of discussion among the women about what was happening in a certain situation in front of an audience, but how are they going to talk about it in the interview with Joanna or amongst themselves? So I was seeing that as kind of a backstage performance. How are their scripts changing? Or I think in our conversation we had before our session, Elsa kind of rephrased that a little bit in terms of, and then as you explained it here, you were saying that it's not as much as the scripts are changing, but it's how one is.
Okay.
Explain that one a little better.
Well, they change. I mean, they do change, but at the same time, they're so embedded in each other. There's a lot of overlap between those role expectations. So, for example, let's just say that I'm becoming more independent, and my mom has been always fighting for that independence. But as soon as I become independent, she's gonna frown upon my choices. So just because then she's still having that role division and role delineation so clear in her mind. So just as an example of how this interchange. And then at home, my son is gonna expect me to be there, follow my role in a more specific way. So even though he may not agree with it.
And then also when I was writing that question, I was thinking also about the women talk about their scripts they're expected to perform in their community, but then also the differences between what their expectations were in Mexico and other cultures in the United States, that they're kind of conflicting with one another. And then what kind of impression management strategies are the women? So this, if you would like to use some of this vocabulary or some of the concepts I raised earlier, along with the setting and the other ideas, we're going to go into the excerpts now. We have about 30 minutes for the discussion. And we have, when we sent you the interviews, the pages were not numbered. So we do have the page numbers that the quotes are on. So this is an exercise in changing scripts. So
nice recovery.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So let's start. I think Joanna and Elsa, we're going to lead us through these, and let's start with just reading together what's on the slide, and then getting some feedback from you all.
What's the gender expectation?
Yes.
The part one.
Right.
Yes,
Yes,
part one.
okay.
part one.
Part one, the first.
So actually, can one of the students read the excerpt?
I'm gonna read about this. I'm not in our culture, men, they don't have problems. Because if they have problems, they don't act like that because, everything can be fixed. They're macho. Everything can be fixed. No? So instead, they hide behind a bottle of liquor.
Okay, so just going into the idea of macho, what are your thoughts about how these women bring up macho, and what are the references to it among some of the other members of the family?
Want to pass the mic?
Oh, I don't have anything. I just can't find it.
It's like the very first paragraph, or the second paragraph. Like A,
Oh,
start
yeah,
talking.
yeah. Okay, duh.
Yes. I put the page numbers just
For me. I can't find it.
So maybe let's think of it in a more specific way. The idea of macho suggests, as we've talked about, a level of control over the woman's free will. So what ways could what's expressed in this excerpt and the other under gender expectation have an effect on a woman's mental health?
Extra battery.
So I would, let's see. Sometimes it takes a while, let's try again.
I think it's just quiet. It's just quiet. I'm gonna try it out.
So I think that if you're looking at the text, you're looking at the words, which we have to do so that we don't have them performing it for us. The idea that the men are pretending like they don't have problems, they're acting. And so the inability to acknowledge and be vulnerable with each other as partners seems to be something difficult. They have to also perform the role of ignoring whatever the problem is that the man is fighting. And then the role of alcohol that becomes a tool to suppress. So you're getting a sense of indirectness and lack of vulnerability, and a little bit of maybe danger that comes with suppression of alcohol. Sure.
I just want to add, I know the women also talked about this level of responsibility and stress that they have related to anticipating and knowing the problems of their children and of their spouse without them having said it, and how if the man does something bad, it's her fault because she didn't stop them. And I think there was like a quote in there where she says something that, like, you're the mother of the children, but you also are the mother to your husband. And I think that kind of reflects here too as well, as far as we talked about mental health. Like, you come home and your husband won't talk to you, he's disengaged, he's just sitting there drinking a beer, doesn't want to talk about anything, clearly is upset, but he doesn't want to talk about it, you don't know how to talk about it, and it's your fault that he's upset. And so I feel like that would be really stressful on your mental health. And there's this culture is that everything's fine, and if you talk about it as a woman, you're being hysterical, and you can't express negative emotions in that way from what you're telling me. And so it seems like this vicious cycle of not being able to really work through things because of these social norms and these gendered barriers that exist within these relationships between the spouses and the children and the community.
I think there's also the issue of culpability, which sort of gets to what Clement's saying. Something that's sort of unspoken, but I'm reading between the lines here, is that like everything can get fixed, right? So he can just do whatever he wants because it's gonna get fixed, but whatever she does, she's culpable for. So it's unequal culpability, which you know, which would cause, or at least for me, it would cause a lot of resentment.
One thing I noticed in this quote as well is that the woman is recognizing that the men have a backstage. So they know that there's a front stage, and they know there's a backstage, and they know something's going on because that's what's happening with the liquor. And they also know that they have to, that they don't act like that. They don't act like there's a problem. So I felt like in this quote there was so much of that push and pull. There's a knowledge of what the script is. There's a knowledge of where you can perform which behaviors, and the conflict that arises that I think would be a very difficult struggle when dealing with problems that may affect your mental health is you're always trying to figure out in which area can you express what. Who is, what's allowed to say where, and you know also that that's going on with other people. So I would think that it would make, for me, I would probably feel anxious knowing that I know there's something going on over here because I know they have a backstage, but I don't have access to it. It's just like an audience doesn't have access to what's going on backstage, but you know that they're back there changing costume.
Can I echo what Carrie said and just say, like, look at the language used. They hide behind a bottle of liquor. That's very much like choreography, right? Like, it's a very intentional, it's not even a metaphor. It's like they put the bottle of liquor in place in front of what is to be seen.
Well, can I jump in too? And I think it's interesting that the liquor itself is what is to be seen, but there's clearly, sorry, GPS talking, is clearly meant to connote, or the women are reading it as this is a signal for a mental health issue, that they are communicating something just in a way that is both veiled and not veiled, that I think kind of puts pressure on or reveals another role that the women are taking on, which is reading and understanding these signs.
Right. So I was going to say, I agree, Allie. I was also going to say it also shows a gendered performance of wellness too, in that, you know, we're seeing the gendered performance of something's wrong in that men drink and women cry. But there's a gendered performance of wellness, which is that women have to be active to show that they're well, right? And that's a whole thing about, the woman always has to be active so she is considered well. They literally say that, which I just think is so interesting because we don't necessarily know if that's true of men. Because men it seems, are able to drink and still be okay. And that's an interesting piece of it. Oh, look, that's the next slide. It's like I knew it.
Nice segue.
Wow. It's like I studied this. Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting piece of this part of what's going on. I also just wanted to mention, I find so much of what's going on in here, the undercurrent of the gendered performance of emotion, which I think is what's happening here, is emotions and mental health. Because it's all intertwined, the crying and the coping mechanisms, all of that is all intertwined. But there's also this like fascinating piece about just like household labor and taking care of humans and care work and all of that, I love that in these interviews in general, not just in these quotes, that those things are so interwoven, and that you see that because of the stories, but also because of the cultural norms and values that you described in the machismo and Marinismo. It's Marinismo, right? The Marinismo. Okay. Yeah. So I think that sort of is fascinating that the gender performances are coming out of something that's about like a household labor and care work and a family. And that then reflects into like emotional norms and what's appropriate for brains and bodies. It's an interesting connection.
I just want to add, we went back and forth with including more of the actual experience of the interview, because and you know, we don't include in here the questions that I asked, right? But you know, I'd like to explore the concept of mental health, which in and of itself, I was trying to explore how they don't see it as mental health, but our terminology is mental health or what have you. And so I explored this idea. I want to explore the idea of mental health and your understanding of that. And it was like immediately they jumped into, you know, first of all, for me, it's if my husband's okay, if my children are okay, oh yeah, and then if I'm okay. And it was immediately jumped into the gender role as anything related to wellness and mental health. And then it stayed on that theme the entire interview. So that role was the centerpiece of if they were well or not, really. And so that was, I just wanted to add that piece because it was, we didn't start in and say, what's your role as a woman? Right. That was not, I never mentioned the word gender at all. And it was actually what surfaced in the just the centerpiece of what was going on.
I want to make a comment about that part that says, so instead they hide behind a bottle of the word. I also, from what I see and what I know too, it's also some that there's not a lot of hope that he can change. When he hides into that bottle of liquor, there's nothing she's going to be able to do. So she has to accept that as her fate, you know, from then on.
Can I also ask about this gossiper? She spends all her time crying and being lazy. What is all that about? Like, I mean,
Should we go to that?
is that on the next one?
No.
Did we
skip
can,
this
we
one?
can we'll wrap it into, I don't know.
Can we wrap it?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm just focused on it. This piece about like the woman is being. Why is she seen that way?
So you're going back to the excerpt on page 1.
Yes, I'm
Yeah,
going. It's still in the. It's right.
I'm just
before.
trying to draw the
Sorry.
attention
Go back to the
to
text.
the excerpt.
Thank you.
It's further in there.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I can read it to you. It says, well, it's a long sentence. And there they deal with it. And as a woman, she is weak. She spends all her time crying. But really, you are reflecting what you feel or what you aren't allowed to say because you're considered weak. So these standards are that all the time the woman is chismosa, a gossiper, or she spends all her time crying. You are lazy. You have nothing to do, so you spend your time crying. You aren't doing anything if you have time to cry or feel bad or feel sad. So the woman always has to be active, so she is considered up. I mean, there's so much there. Right. So much to unpack.
So one of the part is that for the part of the chismosa is that I should never complain to anybody or anyone. Because if it gets back to that other person, then I'm a gossiper right now. Because all my dirty laundry should stay at home. Mm-hmm.
So one thing I thought was kind of really interesting was we were talking about like the front stage and backstage. And so one thing that I was thinking about this, sort of the whole paragraph as a whole is like for the men, there is a clear delineation between work and home. But for the women, there's sort of this pervasive, never-ending quality of performance that doesn't end. So I think that was just kind of interesting to draw those two distinctions. That like the men have their work time and their like relaxed time, but the women just have this like ongoing, never-ending cycle. And then the other thing I thought was really interesting, the way she said hide behind a bottle of liquor, hints at an alcoholism as a mental health disorder. But then, so I read it like when I heard bottle of liquor, I was like, that's a lot. It's probably like indicative of like alcoholism is like mental health disorder. Instead of just like having a drink, because you could say that differently. So I just was curious. I was just kind of, those are the questions I had. Like, is she hinting at a mental health disorder in the husband, or is she saying that's just the way it is? So that
Yeah, I think that interesting that like front stage and backstage is also interesting, and some of the other things that they said where, and this isn't the entire interview, but you know, that idea of if your skirt's too short, what is you're married, why is your husband letting you do that? Or one of the times they said, you know, I knew women that would wear makeup and all these things that look lovely. Sorry, it's not that you look lovely on the makeup, but you would be very put together in that way. And then once they got married, they stopped wearing makeup, they stopped caring for themselves. And that was like, because if you do, then who are you dressing up for? You're married. Why are you doing that for other people? And so it's this idea that your performance is also always a reflection of your husband as well. And so you in and of yourself don't have your own agency because you are a constant, like, you know, why are you working? Doesn't your husband take care of you? So if you're working, it's a bad reflection on your husband. And so I think there's that other piece of not actually being your own actor, that you are in yourself a multitude. And then at the same time, though, then the man with the woman, the married woman without his wife, without the makeup, then has agency to go out and find a woman that is all made up because his wife is not taking care of herself anymore because she's let herself go. So then it's even more understandable. He can look for a woman that's got the short skirt and the makeup because she just didn't care anymore, even though she can't because her husband. So it's this very weird dynamic of who's actually reinforcing what. So I just want to.
And going back to the bottle of liquor is also a social aspect because men will get together to drink. So they will be hanging out with friends for a very long time. So yes, it is a sign of alcoholism. I will also say that it's probably more social alcoholism because they just get together, they hang out, they come home late, and they just having a good time.
This may take me in a direction you don't want to go, so just cut me off. But I'm thinking about this and thinking about if I were teaching this, first of all, how would I frame this so I'm not reinforcing stereotypes?
Mm-hmm.
The second thing I'm thinking about is current culture and somebody like J-Lo, you know, I mean, we've got very different images now of women who are not playing the scripts. So I'd like to just address this.
That was one of my concerns too when I was reading about the poetry.
Can we talk about the teaching part in the second half?
Okay.
Because otherwise I fear that we're just gonna not finish this part. But the second.
Yeah, and we can talk about that.
Yeah,
We
I have
discussed
it down. Highlight.
So I think the other thing we wanted to just kind of with this piece quickly before we move into the next one is just this idea of a woman always having to play a role or be active. So this idea that you're considered lazy if you're doing anything else than constant action. So we just wanted to reflect on that in terms of a women's well-being and mental health, how this notion of always being responsible for how you look and how that represents the whole family as well, this idea that you have to be active constantly in motion and how that might impact ways that you can address challenges with a woman that's having mental health difficulties if this is the expectation in her daily life of constant activity, how that kind of compounds for the challenge. Just any thoughts about that expectation of being active?
So I don't have anything to say about the clinical encounter. To be honest, I'm interested in sort of the general larger issues. But it's just so much reminding me of our nanny, who is a family member. But she never sits down, ever. And I'll tell you later when we talk about Yes, curandera. She told me a very interesting story yesterday while I was reading it. But she never, ever, ever sits down, and she doesn't sit down when she's home either. And I remember just like giving her or taking her for a manicure, and she just was she loved it, but she was uncomfortable because she had like ants in her pants. She was just sitting and relaxing. And I got her a massage once, and she was just like, so that constant activity, is just constant stress, right? You're just like, you're doing everything for everyone. You're never really taking care of yourself. You're never allowing yourself to have even like a moment of rest besides sleeping.
And I guess I would just extrapolate a little bit more to say, is this just, a Mexican American place? I mean, I think we should think beyond like the women in general. I mean, I feel like that all the time, right? And so again, avoiding stereotyping, thinking of it in a larger context too.
So I think what's interesting around this is which parts of this are cultural and which parts of this are gendered and which parts of this are both. And so what I think is very cool about this, and we can talk more about this afterwards, but just as a student right now, I would say what I'm finding very interesting is about how this is a culturally gendered script, right? That what's key here is that, many women talk about that. There's a great sociology piece that was just written about the different kinds of second shifts and extra work that women do in the home when they're in heterosexual relationships, et cetera. This is very common. But what's key here is that this is a cultural expectation that has these like emotional and activity related norms that come with it. And I think that is the interesting piece here is like how it's not just about gender and it's not just about culture. It's like the overlay of both. And so people are they're performing these scripts. And when they don't perform the scripts, there's consequences, there's embarrassment, there's problems. And that's the whole thing we learned just a little bit ago about oppression management.
I'm also wondering, and this is more from the personal experience aspect, but so much of stress and pain causes me to not be able to stop because I know when I stop, like it's actually a form of coping, like to know the moment I stop, I will actually have to feel all the pain, like it will somehow settle. And so I don't know, it's making me question the ways in which the cultural scripts and the gendered scripts actually shape coping mechanisms themselves.
Yeah. I mean, that gets. I mean, when you talk about like clinically appropriate care too, that gets into treatment options too, because understanding ways in which different treatment is actually maybe harmful to certain people if they're used to dealing with and coping with things this way, to say, well, we need to do a self-care practice. It doesn't work. That it might create more conflict and more division between care providers and receivers of care. And like if you're not in touch with those realities.
Just to be mindful.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
This is very quick, but this is making me think as a follow-up to this, my nanny, and I call her my nanny because she takes care of me and my son. But that her backstage is actually our house. That's where she cries, and she only cries to me. She never cries to my husband, but that's the only space she has to have a real backstage. Even though within my house it's different for each person in my house. So her backstage is with me.
To come up with work on the interviews too.
So again, we may not want to go there, but as I'm thinking about, reading these scripts and thinking about these medications, some of the mental health policies, I'm interested in trying to help students. I want to understand how I can help offer options that are palatable and not offensive or making someone feel shame. So is that appropriate now, or should we put that off?
As soon as we get to that needs to get up in our exercise.
Yeah, I think we're trying to end this with something that you can use as a tool for that. So we'll wait till the end of the session, and then you can bring it up if you don't feel like that helps.
For this excerpt, I'm just going to say, this is the third excerpt. I know we're going to move to another excerpt, but for this one,
Should read it out loud.
my son's doctor told him that it would be good for him to go to therapy to express this, because if he's so quiet, isolates himself. Outside, she looks towards the schoolyard. He is like a little tornado, but in class, is like he isn't present. Like he lives in his own world. So he says to me, "Ay, mama," as if I am crazy. So I ask him, "Who told you that?" And he says, "No, it's just that those things are for crazy people. So now I am going to start to communicate more." There's a lot there. That's enough.
It breaks my heart because he's picking up the machismo and beginning to model it already, right? I don't know what to say, but you just recognize the very young boy, and he's already being sort of classified by his teachers in terms of good behaviors, bad behaviors he's learning to perform.
It kind of reminds me a little bit of what I read in Gretchen's article, where she talked about the like goal-oriented performance and was using the concept of like pain, and people like aren't necessarily faking it, but they have a goal in mind and then they're performing in order to reach that goal. And I feel like this is another example of that. And his goal is to not go to therapy. And so he says, "This is what I have to do so that I don't go to therapy. So I'll just do that because of the stigma that he has around going to therapy." So I thought that really tied in well with the performance article.
Yeah. She said that. I thought that this quote at the end where he's talking about another type of role, which is the crazy person. So he's, and this came up in the, about the crying or the gossiper. So there's other social scripts that are happening. So they want to manage impressions. So if I communicate, I will manage my impression that people won't see me as crazy. And so that that also how you perform is not crazy links to gender really clearly in this example, and how it's also generational, that it's so you almost can't talk about Marianismo without talking about machismo as it relates to generations too.
Something also that brings to my mind when I read this excerpt is that I know, and it goes back to my childhood, being introverted, quiet was rewarded. And then coming to US, when you need to speak up and be assertive, and brings a lot of anxiety, social anxiety.
For boys too?
For people, I mean, yeah, for both genders.
Just one more thing I want to say.
Well, yeah, because I was looking at the whole paragraph or quotation. It also seems like she says that our children are more intelligent than us, or they understand things more than we do. And so I'm just also wondering how the son is functioning here in terms of how he sees how his mother is seen, right? So there's this stepping back, right? And he's really kind of introspective, it seems, right? And so it may not be machismo, right? But now he's being asked to act a certain way, when he's really introspective and could be thinking like, this sucks for mom. But to have that knowledge, so I just want to hold that out as a possibility that he is seeing more than we're giving him credit.
And the other thing I wanted to just, in terms of this, because I think what it gets at a little bit is the generational differences that kind of proposing, there is a section where the women talk about their sons saying, Mom, don't let the mom do, what are you doing picking up dad's plates? And whereas the girls are playing a different role. So I just wanted to speak to that a little bit, your thoughts of when you read that about the changing dynamics across the generations with their kids being raised in the United States. In a lot of these excerpts, the issues of mental health are actually being elicited through the children's experience at school, is bringing to the mother's awareness the need that there's something there. And so there's also a lived experience through the kid being in the U.S. system that is exposing the parents to the mental health care system in the United States. It's kind of another one.
I thought even that the son had that conversation with his mother was interesting to me. That it seemed like that was an example of the son seeing his mother as the backstage, where he's sort of processing that request to have mental health services together with his mom to some extent.
Can we have that quote? Can I just add something?
I think, Joanna, what you're raising is the issue of assimilation, right? And the pull and push of the experience of assimilation. That, is just common, I think, for any type of immigrant, right? Getting exposed to American systems of whatever, education or marriage or any institution, and then how that dance goes. I mean, it's a dance, right? How that dance plays out.
I'm also wondering how this idea that knowledge is always power, right? And so it does seem like these women are gaining this kind of knowledge that's powerful, but it's also kind of tragic, right? Because there's no way to exercise it or a place to exercise it within the home. Mm-hmm.
So I think for interest of time, we'll move forward, but there was just kind of that contemplation of even the divide that's sometimes experienced from parents and their kids that are brought up here. And I think that's a theme that comes up a lot in many different ways. But we'll move on to the next. But I think there's shifting gender expectations and roles with girls and boys in the United States that we should think about sometimes how it creates conflicts with parents and their children.
And I think that also this is one of the moments where stereotype is challenged, because it's the girls who are challenging. I mean, they're all challenging the roles of what's happening, but the boy is trying to get the mother to see that there's another role that she could play, which is also kind of interesting in the power dynamics of a mother-son relationship, of a mother being told how to act by her son. What would I do with my son? Like, how dare you?
I think one of the things that struck me the most about the negotiation with the children is when the women are talking about how their daughters don't help them.
Yeah.
That they're learning about all this independence and they're not using it to help them. That's just kind of both knowledge, and it seems to be the women are negotiating their own expectations, gendered expectations of their daughter and of themselves.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's so much there that I'm not even necessarily sure how to unpack. But I think that backstage, front stage kind of allows us to think about that in ways that, I don't know, is that like the backstage? Or is it just simply backstage? I don't know.
So one of the things Goffman talks about and people challenge and discuss is are there multiple backstages, and is there ever actually a completely backstage, right? Like are you on stage in some way, or are there multiple ways of being backstage?
Yeah.
That helps conceptually to kind of make sense of why that scene seems to me to be somehow different but related to what's happening in these conversations. Or yeah, thanks.
Yeah, you might think about like so some of the discussions that people will have is like, so if you're alone with yourself, are you backstage? Are you completely absolutely backstage, or have you developed so many conceptions about who you are that you are even on stage when you are alone with yourself?
For yourself.
So,
yeah.
So Foucault would say you have. So the sociologist here says that there's the panoptical, the gaze is there always. And so that's why when when I learned Goffman, I learned him at the same time as I learned Foucault. And it's really useful to think about those things all together. And I think it's a really neat thing to think about together, but that gets really into fun social science, right? Yeah, research. Anyway. But yes, that's the answer.
There's no identity that's not performed.
There's no identity that isn't performed, and that's what sociologists would always say, and I think performance studies people would say mostly, you're even performing it all by yourself. So there's never really like an alone.
So for the interest of time, we're going to read the next two excerpts consecutively and then have a discussion about both. So would someone like to read excerpt number 5?
And there in Mexico, speaking about religion, if something happens, if your child presents with some sort of disorder, we are often inclined to go to the curandera, or prayers, or we go to the priest. We find a lot of refuge in this religion so that the padre speaks with a person that is having a problem, or if the child is presenting some sort of ups and downs, we ask that the priest helps us, gives us advice because we see him as wiser, but we don't like to recognize, or that it's hard for us to recognize that we had some sort of psychological problem, because immediately after we categorize it into this idea of being crazy.
You'll read the next one too.
Aye. Have you heard about brujeria? That there are these bad things that people do to you with their vibration and bad energy. So they say that sometimes it's not because of an illness, but rather what someone else does to your body. And this is when one is inclined to do the healer curandero.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, I thought you were going to have me read another one.
Can you just read the whole?
So I guess we're interested in thinking about this, the interface with these belief systems and how it may be a different experience coming into the United States. How might the experience with a priest or with going to someone else outside the medical sector, what additional challenges may there be in using that as a resource when they come to the state?
One thing that struck me about this quotation here is your child presents with some sort of disorder. It's so medical, right? The language there, you presents with this or presents with that, I thought was interesting. But then it makes me think, how much is the categorizations we use and the diagnostic categories we use being forced on these situations, right? That this is the correct interpretive lens from which to see this stuff, right? And kind of dismissing what the cultural explanations are.
And I thought it was interesting that the women were talking in this way about children how they perform their development at the different, the pediatrician, like well-child visits. And it was both a source of oppression, but also liberation, because the women would say, well, if the doctors are seeing them regularly and the doctors see this happening, then it's not my fault. Otherwise, in other contexts, if they see the child behaving in this way, then it's considered my fault. So there's the way that the doctor's authority they can also use that role to give the doctor the authority, or you can give it to the priest, or it can go to prayers. There are multiple ways that one could see the behavior, but it is always reflecting back on the role that the woman is playing. So it's almost like she's finding another scene partner.
Mhm.
Like if I find this scene partner, have this discussion, then I'll create this meaning. Is that impression management? Or if I have this one. So I just thought that was so interesting as well, because it was another one of those places in this text where my stereotype was challenged. Like, instead of seeing the doctor as diagnosing a mental health issue as a source of oppression, it kind of gave her relief from always that it's something that has to do with its development. It's not because I'm a bad mother. That to me was really interesting how that worked.
I'm gonna comment about the father, the priest, and even though I grew up in Puerto Rico, Catholicism is very similar to be the same in all countries. At least I feel, and in the relationship that the communities have with the priest is one that is very interesting, because they admire this person. They see them as someone that they really respect, a figure, a very powerful figure. They invite them into the community, they invite them into the house, they cook for them, and I'm just speaking based on my own community. So that relationship is probably one of the strongest part of that. Women looking for help, especially when dealing with mental health or anxiety or any other problem.
And I appreciated hearing about the women's experience in Mexico when they lived in more rural areas, and they kind of talked about how the curandera and the priests were really the best providers, if you will, in the communities, because there just weren't enough like psychiatrists and psychologists. And so they learned to adapt to the situations in which they had, and the priests and the curanderas learned how to care for this population with their own, type of expertise. And I think that, if you're teaching this to medical students, I think it's important to remember that just because it's different doesn't mean that it's inferior. And I think that, we talk about this like witch doctors or these like shaman or, these terms that are just very foreign and very othering to these practices, whereas humans for thousands of years have been doing religion, talking about energy balance and those kind of things across the world to describe illness. So, when I was reading through this, and it was talking about, we just don't tell the provider if we give them tea or massage or these oils. We just don't tell them because we know we're going to get judged. I'm just like, all that just hurts. Like I wish that weren't true, but I understand why.
I also was reflecting on her comments about the padre and the role of the padre in the community. And I come to this discussion, of course, as an ethicist. I spent the first 6 years working in a predominantly Hispanic community in inner city Chicago, and studied theological and philosophical ethics together with a mostly Hispanic group of people, a lot of seminarians included. And I think one application for students in all of this who are intending to be doctors is just an awareness that there are certain decisions that that some communities will want to speak to their spiritual leader about. And it doesn't necessarily matter, if the spiritual leader gives exactly the same advice that the doctor would give, or the same guidance that a counselor, an ethicist like myself would give, but sometimes they will just want to hear it, from the mouth of a padre, and then may feel more peace about accepting that counselor advice.
So I appreciate you guys bringing that up, and I think one of the things that we want as a takeaway with this is indeed that sometimes this idea of brujeria, or also was talking about that it's associated, like the direct translation would be like witchcraft or something, and then it's this concept of the being understanding that concept is much deeper than how we translate it, and that it is sometimes it may represent you can probably voice it better, but this idea of miracles can happen, and some people may then call that brujeria as an insult. And so there's some people believe in a positive way, and some people stereotype it. So again, this is just the idea that there are other practices, there is other things happening in the community, other people that are trusted resources, and that oftentimes that sense of, can I be backstage, just never happens with the physician. It happens with somebody else in their community, perhaps that they trust. So
this is totally backstage that happens, which is very interesting too, and how they believe about the vibrations and the bad energy, and how all the measures that they take to prevent that energy from affecting, babies, and by different measures or other situations as well. But there's a lot of mix between mysticism, like magical realism, faith, and reality. So, and they combine them together to form this word, so much into it, and it's not bad. It's always for the well-being of the other individual. It's never ill-intended, at least for the most part. We can always talk about brujeria as a witchcraft, but it's actually, for the most part, it's actually well intended.
So one thing that is just striking me in this discussion are the different aspects of religion and the different interpretations. So just Catholicism by itself, when we think of like being in the hospital, it's very acceptable for a family to ask for a chaplain to come so they can pray together. And like medical providers were like, okay, like we have a chaplain here, do you need support, social work, whatever. But there's a different level to the brujeria concept that is much more other in our culture. So I just think that's interesting, that dynamic, because if we think just only about Catholicism, it's like, okay, you can have the priest come to pray with you, but it's not a healing. Like, we don't think of it as a treatment, whereas this is really viewed as a treatment. Does that make sense? That there's kind of like different aspects of what role religion plays, and this is the treatment versus just like a therapeutic.
And one more thing is that it also seemed like this was another situation in which they had to perform a certain type of symptomology, because if you were to say that you were working with one of the more traditional healers, and that in itself is crazy. So, that they didn't want to be perceived that way. So there's a way that gets pathologized in and of itself.
But just being Catholic,
right?
What was interesting to me about this section, as well as a number of other sections in this segment of the interview, was that so often there was a religious language or a spiritual language used that in some ways was attributed to Catholicism, but in fact is completely inconsistent with like the body of Catholic teaching, and so I don't know. I've had a lot of levels of reflection through all of this. In a lot of ways, it resonated with my own clinical experience of hearing things expressed in that way. But then having the background that I do, seeing this mismatch, and trying to grapple with what do I do with that? What do I do with that in this in this circumstance and in my role, within the encounter that I'm having, within the clinical encounter that I'm having. I don't know. I think that for me, I think there's a lot to unpack there. But one takeaway that I might try to convey to students is that whatever the person's designation, religious designation is in the banner of the medical record, doesn't necessarily sum up their worldview or all of the thoughts that they have. So if we see somebody expressing these kind of things and we think, oh, okay, because the religion described in the banner says this, therefore this kind of spiritual response is the thing that's going to help them a lot. It just isn't necessarily that case, because they may be using some of that language to express something else.
I think that is a lovely segue to the last part of this presentation before we move to part 2, which is a framework that we believe may be helpful in the clinical encounter to begin to explore belief systems and practices that physicians were not trained to maybe that kind of don't fit with the typical biomedical model. And so this is one of several different mnemonics that can be applied. And so the idea, which we're not going to do today, but the idea was to have an exercise where students, this is like the old carts, onset, the kind of thing. And so this is a similar mnemonic that can be used. Some people more recently have added the S, which could be spirituality and seniors. That's kind of a more addition from other authors, but this is a mnemonic that we thought they could using what has been learned in the interviews to work with a partner and go through this mnemonic and explore, for example, the explanation of what they believe the symptoms may be, such as somebody wishing ill will on me and I became depressed because someone, because of evil eye or other things, and then exploring ways of verbalizing with a patient in addition to coming to see me, what other things are you using to treat illness or to stay healthy, and what other healers and so forth. So we thought that this could be, we felt that this brought up a lot, and for someone that is like, I've never heard of this before and I have no idea, what would I do then if a patient did have these other practices or did believe of other beliefs around an illness. And so we thought that it was important to provide some type of actual tool that could be used in the clinical encounter to start to help unpack this with their patient about and open their eyes to different perspectives around causes of illness and treatments that would be most appropriate to the individual themselves.
Can I just ask a question, Joe? So the one thing that seems like it's missing, if anything, from this list, it's a great list. But when I'm thinking about what we just talked about in terms of gender and the gendered cultural lenses around this, it seems to me that one of the things that we were hearing was like barriers to access related to gendered performance or gendered social scripts. And so what's missing, it seems like, from this is what are the barriers that you're experiencing, if any? Am I missing that? Like, is there anywhere that we can that
Barriers to
like so?
Or
Yeah. So this seems like it's a you've got some symptoms. How are you understanding them? What's going on? And I guess I'm wondering if there would be, we add an extra letter that would address that. No.
I think negotiate is
Negotiate is that?
but it's not explicit.
But it's not. I'm not critiquing it in terms of saying like I think it's a great step, but I think that's the one thing that feels like a mismatch for me in terms of what we've been talking about is that it feels like there's something more than just trying to figure out what they need. It seems like it's like we might know what's going on, but they might not be able to do it because of whatever reason. And so anyway.
I have another questionnaire that's a little longer than this one that addresses the social determinants of health and addresses some of the behaviors in a more specific way. Maybe we can actually ask some other questions to keep it short in that framework as well. I could look into that. We can look into that. But I agree with you, it doesn't address the gender roles or the barriers socially that are going on in the house.
Like related to machismo and Marinismo.
Gender roles and so on.
Okay, we can talk more about that.
Maybe we should save that for the next round, take a break, because we had some various ideas for what activity could be at the end. And should we take our break?
Yes, 5 minutes, guys.
5 minutes?
Taskmaster.
We never start on time, so we have to get short.
We started 15 minutes late, yeah.
Did we?
So we pretty much have timed it out based on when we
Good
started.
job. Yeah, great
Right.
presentation.
What's next?
Go eat all the cheese. I didn't have lunch, so I like ate all the cheese. Pretty much.
Good, you got your protein.
I did. Maybe being transparent. Jim before yesterday. I had dim sum, so I did not fast. We went to dim sum.
I don't fast you.
I mean, I never fast, but
Elias did.
we like fully ate. But we went and had a sabiki sandwich, Israeli sandwich, Tuesday night after sundown. You gotta have it. It's so delicious.
I don't even know what that is.
I just
I
discovered.
have to go. Thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you for saying what I was trying to say so much better.
Oh,
No, seriously.
every time you open your mouth, I'm
Lily, it's recording, right?
literally every
Did you
time.
stop? Did you pause it? Why don't you pause it?
So creepy, don't put show that's me. It's the new falafel. I have this book.
What is this? Oh, decoration.
So it's by the people who do Sahav, and yeah, so there's a second book called Israeli Soul,
Evil boy.
and it's a kind of sandwich with fried
That is
eggplant
so
and Israeli. So we had some questions for you all. I've been keeping track of some of the things that came up, but I wanted to kick us off with Christy's question, because when we were collaborating together, my knowledge of this community and culture is minimal, very minimal, and theirs is in depth. And so I felt like when I was looking for things or making contributions or even trying to have the conversation, I would get stuck on language. I would get stuck on, like, if I say this, is it a stereotype? So I felt like I had the experience in working with some of the material that I might have if I were someone, a faculty member who was wanting to take on this material and teach it, who doesn't feel culturally attuned. So what are some thoughts about how we could still provide this material for someone to teach who's not familiar with the culture without, to try to prevent the stereotype trap?
So I think most of you guys know that I have a PhD in Middle East studies, and we're very, very, in my training, we were very, very sensitive to this idea of just like a culture, you know, or all Muslims do this, or all Middle Easterners do this. And so I think the way to frame it is cultures with a little c instead of a big C, and delve into that, problematize that, right? Because there are, you know, even in the excerpts that you gave, there are things that resist the big C. And the whole point of the portrait is to make things very complex. Because, you know, in so many ways, medical education does not do that in other ways, right? Especially cultural competency. Yeah, that's what I would say, is focus on the little seeds.
So like,
and the moments of those little seeds.
so creating questions that would elicit the complexity.
So to add to that, I think you have a really great opportunity, because you're talking about scripts, to talk about cultural scripts, again, with little c. I think you introduce the concept of a dominant cultural script that exists in Hispanic and Latino culture. And I think you can say that that impacts this community in different ways.
and that people are interpreted. This is impression management. We are always being understood through that lens, whether or not we are actually associated with that culture, right? Like if people are a part of the community that is connected with machismo culture, they will be interpreted through that lens. And so I think if the way I would try to frame this a little bit is to say, here's a cultural lens that relates to this community. Let's talk about how these stereotypes and these cultural frameworks impact this group. And so rather than talking about the group themselves, I would talk about the cultural framework and the cultural scripts, because that's what you're doing. I think that that would just shift it a tiny bit from the sort of reinforcement of stereotypes to the reinforcement of scripts. And I think scripts are very, 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 that's what I think was beautifully done with the Maria book, Paradox book. You're showing us what those scripts are, and then I think you can sort of unpack that a little bit more there. I would also say that I agree with you, Elsa, when you were going through the language section. I think that was really important to unpack. But I was thinking, I have a good friend who does work on, who's in Chicago on Latino cultures, and one of the things he studies is Latinx, the word of Latinx, and he's written about it, and written about that dialogue, and in fact, this issue of the fact that it doesn't speak to the language. And I think, so even that, I don't think there's like a holistic one perspective, which is what you said. Like, but I think it's important even there to say Latino folks are writing about this, and there's debate even within the culture. So I think trying to unpack that is really useful.
Could you get us
His work,
and then maybe we could include that as a recommended read.
Yeah. I have not read enough of his. I mostly read his Twitter feed. He's wonderful. But I don't know which pieces he's actually written, but I can try and source it. His name's Jonathan Rosa. He's a sociolinguist. I love him. He's wonderful. But yeah, so I think but even just the piece about the fact that there's dialogue about this and there's debate, even just mentioning that I think would be useful, which you did, but I think I'm happy to go ahead.
So yeah, the way I would frame the question that I think Laura's getting at and I'm getting at is, how do women, or these women in this community, navigate that larger script? Because the navigation is really the interesting thing. Right. And that, everybody navigates these kinds of larger contexts and larger expectations differently. And that's where the richness comes in, I think. So I would ask that question, like, how are these women navigating these things?
I think it's important whenever talking about cultural competency or cultural humility, or however you want to use the term, is to remind everyone that everyone has a culture, because it's surprising to me how often, especially people who are white, default to like, well, I don't have an ethnicity. Like, that's, culture and ethnicity is something other. And it's worthwhile just reminding everyone that everyone has a culture, everyone has an ethnicity, everyone has a language, and there is no default. And sometimes just saying that is enough to kind of reset people. But I do that every time I even mention the word culture or ethnicity, is that everyone has that. There is no kind of blank or default.
So I'm back to thinking about how you help somebody negotiate a situation that actually feels so complex. Particularly, oftentimes, you're going to have a very limited appointment time, right? So when we think about what resources and support, looking at this list, I still get stuck on words and how to frame therapeutic options. But when I think back to Hispanic women that I've worked with, and very difficult problems where there are semanticizing, issues, where there, I suspect, abuse going on in the home. You know, I tend to want to put the issue on the table, which may or may not be the right thing to do, as I understand, you know, the complexity of this. But I also think, okay, so the padre has great power in this situation, but are they going to be the most helpful therapeutic person? The limitations on mental health resources, but particularly some of the purposes they can say you're crazy and suggest that they can counselor. By the way, I was going to say at the beginning, when you're talking about mental health issues, I think we need to talk about the dearth of mental health professionals and talk about the dearth of mental health professionals who are Spanish speaking.
We had
Yeah.
it.
Sorry, yeah, we were trimming some things.
I would put that back in, because I think the waiting list and the barriers to actually getting in to see a counselor would be huge. But there are perhaps other, I mean, the group, the healing circle, to me seems like, wow, they kind of created something that was a safe space for themselves. So I know we're trying not to be too medical the way we look at things, but I do want the students to come out with a sense of how do I use this knowledge to more skillfully help people who need services get services that are acceptable to them and don't contribute to staying in their ICU. I love the conversation about generation, because I think that's a really crucial avenue when you're dealing with a family where, say, you've got a young girl, and the young girl doesn't want to help around the house, and the young girl, you know, that wants to wear short skirts, and you know, you're getting all of these culture clashes going on in the home. To also use that as an opportunity to help the matriarch of the family think about her own feelings and her hopes and dreams for her daughter. But I guess I'm just kind of throwing that out there. Is there a way we can sort of bring this back at the end to helping people navigate the personal connection, particularly if, you know, I'm not from that culture, but I want to convey how much I care about you, how concerned I am about the symptoms that you're having, and, you know, try to help them strategize a role that would be empowered, you know, and a script that would be empowering.
This is just a quick point. I don't think we should be assuming that medical students are white. I mean, our medical students, there are going to be lots and lots of Hispanic medical students. So, you know.
Did I say something that was different?
No, I'm just saying. No, you did not. I'm just saying for ourselves, we should also be very attuned to the diversity of our student body.
Yeah,
This is kind of like the dynamic we had in our group, where we had someone, you know, had folks who had real deep knowledge and someone who had very little knowledge, and we had to kind of negotiate that amongst ourselves too. I think that would happen amongst the students, that you'll have students from different cultures and some that may be within the culture. So I really like this idea about reframing the question to how are the women navigating the social scripts, because that's an entry point for people from different
So to go back
perspectives.
to the exercise, you know, thinking about what might that look like at the end, to have them think about what they've learned, to think about this framework. They're both like,
Right. Do you want to talk about your idea?
So one idea that came is that use the scripts and pair them with pictures, and then do sort of like an empathy cards exercise. You know, what do you see in this card, or what do you see in this phrase? And kind of, you know, in that way we can have an active discussion about it without really judging that, and anybody could do it with some scripting in behind. The other thought that I have is also use close reading analysis to what the excerpts say as well too, and maybe that might be the best way to actually work through the excerpts without really getting into stereotypes and.
So I'm talking about. So I had a thought about so we did some close reading. That was our sort of model here, and I really like that model. Obviously, we used it too. The drawback, I think, of that in this situation was that we read the 3 interviews, and for me, I felt like I was constrained a little bit in talking only about the specific excerpts that you chose. And the slight difference in the way that it worked here with the interviews was that interviews aren't a sort of framed story the way that like the narrative was that we had chosen. And so we were trying to highlight specific pieces of Eliza's story. But in this case, it's just like a little chunk of words. And I wanted to focus on different words and talk about the overarching story a little bit more. And so I wonder if it might be useful to think about starting big and letting us talk a little bit more broadly. Because I heard us all doing that while we were trying. We were trying to be good students. And we were really trying. This is like our, 10th one or whatever. We're really working at it, but we were struggling with it. And so I think that's something to think about is if maybe doing close reading like as the second piece so that you can pull us back into the words. But I think letting us start broad might be a good idea. The other thing to think about is, and this may be just because I'm a narrow person when I want to teach these things, but I was struggling in part because I know this field really well with focusing on wanting to really delve deeply into gender and really wanting to delve deeply into religion and feeling some tension in both because I didn't feel like we got to go enough into either. And I could tell there's so much in both of these, and if I were a student, I would want to unpack more. So I wonder, I don't have an answer for you, this is your portrait, but I wonder if it's worth sort of trying to decide which direction might be more fruitful, and if you only need, because these are such rich interviews. I came away again wishing I had been in the interview, so it's good. Although I wouldn't have understood it because I don't speak Spanish. But I think like maybe just one section you could unpack it and just decide which one, and just give us the information from, if there's any setup that we need on either direction. I think that might have worked. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out, and I have more thoughts about it, but I wanted to just say that.
And then the other thing, and maybe I missed it though, but I had no sense of where I was with these. Like I needed a frame.
Yeah.
I needed to tell me where they come from, what's going on. Like Rebecca provided that, I think really well when she revised hers. And we can show you that revision, or it's on the drive, right? But give us a sense of how these interviews came about. Right? Because you do it afterwards, and knowing some of that up front, I think would be very, very helpful. Before we read it. Just going into it, I was just like, what is going on here? Like, who's interviewing these?
Right.
Why are they being interviewed?
So this was a question that came up in the group too. So if we did that, that would be in the teaching guide, and whoever's teaching it could, if we had like a PowerPoint that someone could use. So we tried to provide that context in the setting, but then including more information about the setup of the interview. Because that was in one of the drafts, and I think I cut that out because we had to trim somewhere. But that would, I'm sorry to read it. Pardon me?
Yeah, what Rebecca did is her packet of readings, when she was pulling excerpts out, she wrote a paragraph that introduced them. They were part of the reading.
Right.
So it wasn't part of the teaching guide itself. It was attached to the reading.
Okay.
Right, and so that's why the student is going to get that before he or she or they begins the reading, right?
I want to read for a little bit about the gender and the religion. Because I think in some ways what's really cool about this portrait is the idea of intersectionality and how complicated it is. Whereas I think if we consider this maybe a more advanced portrait, that we're expecting them to be able to navigate, multiple identities. Because I really do like having them together and things go through to me in terms of issues I work with for me.
So I want to make it very clear. I did not mean to say you should do one or the other. I think if I were to choose, I probably would choose the religion piece, honestly. Even though I, as a gender scholar, love the gender stuff where you unpack machismo stuff. But I think that stuff is actually a little bit more clear. It's a little, those are more, you've already, you told us that in your description of the frames, right? You're giving us the cultural script. So then having us apply this cultural script to the religion, the discussion of religion and Maria and all of that kind of stuff, I think makes them do the analytical work even more. So that's what I'm trying to do, is see if you can, I think this stuff where we're wanting to do this sort of unpacking of the weak woman and the gossiper and all that, which is fascinating and great. I think they could do that and it would be great. But I think, to me, it got really exciting when we got to the religion, and I didn't feel like we got to get enough time there. So that's what I'm trying to say, is I think you could spend time talking about both in more focused religion. But I might be wrong about that. I just wanted to.
Well,
yeah.
Sorry.
Go for it.
I was just going to add that I think one of the questions I took away is, what is the social issue itself? So in part of the discussion, the social issue was gender roles. Part of the discussion, and forgive me if I'm taking something else out, but part of the discussion was about kind of the expectations around religion's role in medicine. Another social issue was around the stigmatization of mental health that is specific to this community. So I think that clarifying what the main social issue that you want to address will help with some of these things, even though they are overlapping. And I hear what you were saying, Joanna, about not actually asking about gender, but asking about mental health, and it was all about gender. So it's sort of a false distinction, but kind of foregrounding in the questions which one you want to take away, or what is the main social issue, might help make some of those decisions.
That's exactly what I was trying to say. You said it better, Riley.
So I wrote the exact same thing that Allie just said, which was, what is your main point or goal, right? So, and I think you can explicitly nod in the portrait to, like, this is getting layered on with this, and this is getting, but to have a central question or a central goal, because I was also sort of confused. Is this really supposed to be about mental health? Is it supposed to be mostly about religion? What is this? What are they trying to do? And then I want to sort of give some suggestions that I have. Is that okay? Okay. So I think for the, I sound like a broken record, but I think for the questions that are in the teaching guide, to me, they were too much about the clinical encounter, too individualized. And so I wanted to get a sense of, like, what are the structural issues here? What are the big contextual issues? And the reading about the cuts in Chicago of mental health services and the lack of access to mental health services seems to me to be one of those structural issues. It doesn't mean you have to choose it, but it struck me as super interesting and not so much addressed. But it might be an interesting window to talk about, well, because in that reading also it says stigma is like 6.6%, but really the issue is access. And that gets into all these cuts that have been going on, right? So that's a possible angle. It doesn't have to be the only. I mean, that would be a sort of a big shift, but a new direction. you can reject that, but it's an idea. And then I was looking at the Maria paradox exercise, where they say, like, write down the shoulds. And I thought maybe that might be an interesting exercise instead of the algorithmic ethnic thing, because I think they're going to get that, or they could get that in a different thread. And that feels, again, to me to be very clinical and countery. So what else should I say? Yeah, that's it. That's it. Those are the main things.
Also, I just want to jump in super quickly. Sorry that I missed most of this, but just bringing in some of the conversations we had for the other portraits of looking at a variety of ways that the facilitator could take it based on what they feel comfortable with and also what they feel their students are wanting in the moment could be another option to have a kind of general starting point of looking at or touching on all of the issues and then having different questions to delve into different issues deeper.
I don't have a solution for what I'm about to say, but I just thought I'd lift up the risk as I had observed it. So particularly around the religious aspects of it, I think that there's a pretty high risk of stereotyping and also about conveying some things or attributing some of the comments to a particular religious group that don't reflect the theology of that religious body. And I think if the students wouldn't have that theological background, they wouldn't know that. So I think, for example, in the Marian paradox, attributing certain behaviors as and categorizing them as Marianismo, which I recognize is different than Marian theology, but there's a significant mismatch there. And so I worry about that conveying of inaccuracies and sort of stereotyping along those routes. I don't know. It was a concern that I had.
There's a section in the interviews that I think pull that out actually as something to discuss. So it's a section where they talk about the men quoting the Bible without having gone to church, and
yes,
whatever they want to say, they say it's in the Bible without knowing what's in the Bible. Yeah. So there might be a way we could use what's in the interviews to make that point. It's like cultural scripts can be made up without any basis in the actual theology.
So that's what I was going to say. I think it's very useful to, if we are going to go in this direction, and I think that is the direction that you want to go, is to explore the religious and spiritual aspects here. They are being used as cultural scripts. So religion is a proxy here for culture, and it's definitely affected by theology and by religious practice. But in this particular situation, it is a cultural script again. And so I think the more we emphasize, again, and that's why it's so wonderful that you have this particular framework and lens that you're using in this setting, is that you don't have to necessarily, you're not using a theological framework. And so you don't have to tell them, but I think it is, I think Erica's point is really useful in that maybe at the beginning, again, what you can sort of start with is when one of the things I noted was in the oppression management sort of section, because that's my field, I have some thoughts about which parts I would emphasize and not.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
But I think one of the things you might want to do is give some examples and mention that some of the scripts that we're going to explore today are related to cultural scripts, related to gender and religion. And just by stating that, you're starting the group off with the expectation that these are not, this is how scripts work, and then you can go from there. I think that would be great.
One other observation was that I saw that religion I'm sorry, I don't remember which slide it was on, but I think it was under the section on barriers, when we were talking about barriers to mental health treatment. Faith or spirituality was listed as a barrier. But then I thought it was interesting that in the pre-reading materials, one of the selections was from Health Progress, and it described the work at St. Anthony's, which is a Catholic healthcare institution that it was aiming to extend mental health services in the area. So I thought it was, in the readings, we saw that as also potentially part of a solution as well, but that didn't come up in the segment.
So if I can make a comment, something that we also kind of ties in what you're saying and then what Sandy's suggestion, I grapple with the fact that the other part I wanted to emphasize that was not in the themes that we were assigned was the appropriate way of addressing mental health in a community context such as this. And so the Carrillo article gets at that and explores how, and I thought it was interesting too that it is from a Catholic journal, that they're meeting the needs of the community based on where the community is coming from. And that the other part was then the little village, the focus groups, and the way that they elicited that. And so I felt like I wanted to, and maybe I was layering too much, but I felt that something I wanted as a deliverable was an appropriate form of healthcare that's not you just hang your sign, doctor, whatever, psychiatrist, and that people are going to get in line. Like one of the reasons why Carrillo's work is so effective is because it's not in a hospital, it's not in a clinic setting, it's in a community center that would make people want to come in. It's part of a larger conversation and other dialogues and other things that are community appropriate. And so I really wanted that as part of the deliverable because I felt like it's so important for students to know, and that's something in this community that they highlighted is that, that's people aren't just going to show up to a therapist because it's considered like I'm crazy if I see a therapist. And so if we know that, then we should be adapting practice to so that people don't feel, so that we're meeting them where they're at kind of thing. And so I felt like that wasn't, that wasn't brought together. And so I don't know if framing it from that way as the big thing that you're talking about. So that's kind of how I was trying to end it with
I wouldn't use that. That's personal. I mean, you guys have to make that choice.
I just recognized that it was introduced, but in the article and then in the beginning, but then it wasn't wrapped into the larger conversation. And so I wasn't really sure how to make that a part of it, or just not even try and go there because it's too much.
Well, I think, so this gets back to the thing about the cuts in Chicago. I think you can ask and end there. I would also agree. The question would be, how do we create responsive healthcare systems? So instead of a clinical encounter, look at it as a system, right? And so when you have cuts, that's not like helping the being responsive, first of all. Or if let's say this is maybe the community-based healing circle is a response to those cuts, right? And so it's a community-based response, like it's an effective response that that you can ask that kind of question, but in a systems framework. And then one more thing to say, but I think in terms of the issue about theology and the mismatch, to me, I would be more interested in, again, this navigation question. So, there's always theology, and then there's how people are actually practicing or, using religion to do X, Y, or Z. So to me, that's about, again, the big R and the little r. But what are the strategies? What are even the gendered strategies, right, that people are using in terms of religion? Like, how are they strategizing their religion to almost to explain their behavior, or it gets to the lived experiences of religion and the issue of how do you navigate, I think, rather than issues about theology.
Yeah, just to clarify, I think I'm not so much concerned about the mismatch in the particular patient encounter, and would agree with you. It's really more about how are they using it and how do we work with them. But where I worry about it a little bit is in the stereotypes that the audience could walk away with because of that.
So, I just want to clarify what I meant is like how to end it. What might be good. I mean, this is just off the top of my head. When you explained that Little Village project, I got like a happy feeling. Like it sounds great. It's a very cool project, and that would have been a great place to end. It feels like a very productive and like cool spot to learn about how people are from a research perspective, but also from a practice-based perspective, like making change in this around mental health and gender. So what might be kind of neat is to start with Michael's idea of like when you hand people the interview, give them a sort of explanation generally about the fact that this comes from a bigger project. These are women from Little Village and, whatever, talking about, what have you. If you want to frame it as, and again, depends on which excerpt you use, if you want to frame it as, we didn't ask any questions around this, but we started, however you want to frame it. Then in the end of the talk, say, I want to leave you with some more information about this community and some changes. That might be a really productive, rather than an active activity, which we've just spent all of our time doing. So I'm not sure we need to have, we just, discussed the medical students. It might be really great then to close up with that. I think that might really work. Plus it's pretty pictures.
So
Again,
you decide. Like this solicitation of how to work, it's more of a solution to some of the challenges is developing
a potential
community-based.
And what I think is kind of neat about this as a potential solution is it's both practice and research, which is kind of neat because I don't think our students get to hear nearly enough of community-based practice and community-based research. So in some ways, I think it also brings in the lens again because we do some of that work in performance studies. I think it would be a neat sort of package. Again, you do with it what you will, but I think that might be a good solution, especially since the ethnic I think is a cool concept, but I'm not sure right now that it's connecting your goals, because I think that's where I got confused, was because it felt like the goals didn't match the beginning because there's multiple things happening. And I like the multiple things, but if you end with one thing that's addressing what felt like religion, then it doesn't feel like it's taking account of everything else. And so that's,
I agree. I really like that idea. And I wonder if you just want to close also by inserting, what is it, 6 rules based participatory research. I mean, I think you sort of described them in the beginning, but to actually call them out. Yeah.
Because I was struggling with how to place it in the context of a researcher. Like at first we actually did the performance lens from the perspective of me doing the research. And I think Carrie had a really good, we really wanted to look at the performance lens from the lens of the interviews themselves. So I think that was a really good move, but I think this allows us to integrate that experience of the researcher a little bit more without making it a center of the narrative, but it's more of providing the context around it, which is in the beginning, and then again it ties it in the end of like, this is an approach, not only a solution in the community, but an approach as someone engaging in community of how to do it in a way that is reciprocal.
Yeah, and it does get to the barrier issue that Laura brought up, right? That was missing from that ethnic, because you can say like, so how do you create and provide, effective services that are responsive to the community? Well, or that are responsive to the barriers of the community. Sorry. Well, the Little Village, project is one of the ways to do that. And
tease it right.
Yeah,
it's great.
And Joanna, you can use that critical portraiture research article.
No, I thought that was like another, I thought it
Well,
was.
yeah, you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. Don't do that. do what Christy's saying. Yeah, I would agree.
The model's a good idea. Yeah, but easy.
I just want to make a comment. I mean, I think the feedback is great. I trying to get my head around all of it, but I also want to clarify that the Hispanic community and intersectionality is so strongly tight that it's just hard to separate. And the Marianismo is something that, I mean, the main reason why I left as I said at the beginning, why I left my hometown is because of the pressure that I had as a woman, an independent woman, single mom, and with a lot of ambition, who was different from others. But I'm not a religious person. So, but it's that culture that is ingrained and is untold and you have to live through. So I feel that is going to be very, very hard to separate and understand how Hispanic women are going through, and then how that actually could lead to, a negative cognitive involvement and lead them to mental health illnesses in the future. It's a lot of pressure to deal with.
So I think the problem that I push back here is I agree with you completely. What it felt like there were multiple different pieces of religion that you were unpacking. And I think that might be what would be interesting to explore. Is like, I think that, at least as I understand it, machismo and Marianismo is very connected with Catholicism and with Christianity. Is that correct? And then the other piece of the sort of witchcraft and all of that felt like a sort of a separate piece that we were exploring. That's where I started feeling disconnect. So I wonder, that's where I think the religion piece and the mental health and all of that seems very intertwined. I completely agree. But it felt to me like we were having to unpack multiple layers of religious pieces within the community, as well as gender. And it just felt like a lot to try to uncover in 30 minutes. That's all I'm trying to say. I see your point. I don't think you could do the gender piece without religion or the religion piece without gender. I just think that those two pieces felt separate to me, and I would pick one. That's all I was trying to say.
An idea here, and I don't know, maybe this would expand it too much, but I'm thinking it might help focus it a little bit. There was an article a couple of years ago in one of the bioethics journals, and I could probably find it, that talked about miracle language. I presented a taxonomy for miracle language, and the different ways people will invoke that kind of a language, in some ways kind of more strategic, like so that they can get what they want, and other ways to get clinicians to back off. I wonder if something like that kind of a taxonomy here might help provide a little bit of structure to that aspect of the conversation.
I think that might help actually. Something that I explored and tried to find a narrative that will fulfill this is alternative medicine, alternative ways of practice, because they're very intertwined with faith and spirituality. And but there was not much out there. I mean, all of this is like, if I talk to which I tried to get them together to write something, and I failed miserably, is that how we can talk about the home remedies that we went through when we were children, and the prayers and all that, and we all share and we all laugh about it. Written, there's not much in there. And so, I mean, I think it's something that, again, there's a lot of room for improvement there, and I think we can maybe, I will insist on my students and see if I can get them together and maybe write something about our home remedies and how, because they're very intertwined with religion. And something to clarify is that also there's a lot of it's mostly Christian, a lot of Catholicism and Hispanic culture, but the other type of Christianity that might not believe in Maria, Virgin Mary, but they will still follow the same similar rules of engagement in society.
Should we clarify that in our teaching guide?
I don't want to, I will probably have a disclaimer about that should not be generalized to communities. That is, I mean, I'll probably just say that this was a conversation that women actually spoke about, but yeah.
So I think you're getting at organized religion and then like informal religion, right?
Yeah.
Which every community I've ever studied, including my own, that always happens. That's just a very common phenomenon. And making that explicit, I think, is totally fine. To me, that still remains within this larger idea of religion and religious practice. Religious scripts, by the way, I love the way that you guys integrated all the performance stuff. I think that's really great. Really strong aspect of this portrait. So making, sort of the big C, the little c, the organized religion, the informal religion, making those more explicit would be, I think, very helpful. And I have one more thing I wanted to say, but I totally forgot as usual. I'll get back.
One of the things that we talked about doing for the next iteration of this is in the teaching guide. Now I want to add the prologue to situate the conversation, but then have the questions use the performance vocabulary to elicit the conversation about scripts.
That's right.
So we kind of came to actually what kind of performance frame we went back and forth again, because we were trying to figure out how to use the analytic to get to the larger social theme. And so we were going back and forth about it. But I think that because that kind of came in at the end, we weren't able to use it in writing the question. So I think that maybe now that we've gone through this, it will help us figure out how to use the excerpts and to take the questions that we've already have with the performance questions and kind of put them together to match it. So I feel like after giving that information and then seeing what people picked up on, I'm wondering if maybe there's too many Goffman terms. Like maybe I should just put like 3 or 4, because some of it just gets too deep. And when we were analyzing, I felt like maybe we only need, if people latched on to certain ones.
Yeah.
So I think that would be easier for people to keep in their minds as well.
Yeah,
And something a little different from what Gretchen did, but also really related to what she did for her portrait.
I remembered what I was going to say. You were saying that you are having a hard time finding something about this informal religion stuff and the symbols of religion. Maybe I'm getting the wrong anthropologist name, but isn't it Levi-Strauss that writes about this? I mean, you could give an article or a piece of his, isn't it? Levi-Strauss?
I mean, Levi-Strauss talks about the raw and the cooked and the way that people, is that what you're thinking of? Like the way that people interpret? But would medical students read that?
Well, that's a whole other question. But
I'm saying the exact same thing without a mic, by the way. Same thing.
I think that is a great question, but I guess I'm just putting out there, like, can we, maybe a way to get around the fact that there was no article or whatever about this specific thing is to sort of blow out and get even bigger and say, this is sort of these are phenomena of all religions and all lived experience of religion.
So before we do that, by the way, before I even keep talking, I really enjoyed this. I mean, just the reason I'm hammering at this in some ways is because it was fun for me and I really liked it. Okay, just saying that. Thank you. Okay. So the thing I really want to clarify here, because I think it's so rich, is that I'm struggling still to figure out exactly what that nugget is, what the thing is that you want us to take away. And I think if it's religion and it's, this formal versus informal, that's really great. if it's something about the gendered experience of religion, I feel like
Yeah.
there's only 75 minutes, right, that we
Right.
get. And I feel like we have, you know, the 10 to 20 minutes of prep work at the beginning where we're learning about, maybe it's less now because you're going to give us less document terms and we're going to put the stuff at the end. So it's a little bit less time, but we still don't have that much time to get involved in this. So I think it would be really useful to figure out, like, what do we want the take-home point to be, that when students leave the room, they say, I now know that in Hispanic culture, this is true, or this is how people navigate. That's what I'm still struggling with.
So what's interesting,
Yeah.
you know, if we were to build this around what the women said, it would be gendered.
Right.
If we were to build it around religion, that was like, oh my God, we gotta fit in religion. Oh my God, I gotta ask a question about religion. So at the end of this whole dialogue, by the end they're talking over each other and they're super into it, I said, I want to explore how religion intersects with yada yada, and then they said, oh, you know, the prayers help me and all this other stuff. And so I felt like that was a little bit more put on it, and even the amount of time spent in the conversation was very little, because I was probing for that, and they each had one core comment about the religion, and that was it. So the dialogue, like, gender wasn't even one of our themes, but it became so ingrained in how a woman experiences her own, like, mental health, that's why I feel like that should be the center, even though.
Fine, great.
Because there was just so much more.
The first person narrative is supposed to be the.
Sorry, I just snapped
The first person narrative is the thing that's supposed to be the jumping point. It's the springboard. So, I mean, I think that's okay, right? I know that the social theme I gave, was given to you and this is what it said. But, things are flexible and this is iterative, and we need to make it true to what you are interested in and what you found, and that's total, it's fine.
So this conversation it gets to a meta issue I've had with all of the portraits so far, is the balance between a big takeaway message that could be applied in many contexts and then the specifics of the example. Because I rewrote our objectives, and there are too many still, but I thought maybe that looking at this particular community was an example of how gender, performing cultural scripts, basically a performance of identity, plays into how people experience and access mental health treatment, all of these things, because we will learn something about Hispanic women, but we will not be, you can't take that and apply it in other contexts, that's specific, but we can apply all the lessons that the specific example has taught us to other contexts. And so I feel like we still need to work out the learning objectives and how they relate to one another, but I think that's maybe part of what this experiment is when you bring, and maybe it's also because I'm not understanding the example so much, and I'm thinking more about the method. So I'm thinking about that as well. But how do we make sure that they have enough specificity so they learn something specific, but that the larger issue is something that's generalizable that they could take to other communities, right? So
Carrie, I
that's a
like that,
struggle.
and I want to actually push you a little bit on this case using idea of counter, using a counter example. So when you think about it, what you've done with disability, talked about what are the prominent images, narratives, and then you propose them, provide counter examples. And I'm thinking about, this, going back to the idea of community-based participatory research and having, some of this come from the community up. How can you get them to talk about counter examples? How can you get them to dialogue about what's fixed and what's fungible, what can be? Because I feel like, there's some internalized oppression Is that fair? Do you think that there's some internalized depression going on here in um, cultural roles and scripts that we're talking about?
Yeah, and it's internally driven. Nice.
And so as, again, somebody who cares about mental health and cares about, freedom of choice, is that part of our role here to help think about how maybe you don't just come in and say that's the way it is, but you come in and try to help them have some tools,
Right,
have counter narratives.
because I feel like those were some of the things we were pulling out. The way that they were pushing back against the scripts, and the way they were trying to negotiate impression management in different contexts to get what they needed, and also then with their children. So the things that were unexpected kind of kept coming up, and I was trying to highlight the places where there were conflicts.
So
Right.
would you, well, I guess what I'm saying is, would you do that with the women themselves?
Do more interviews?
No, do that.
Joanna's her head's going to explode.
Would you help women understand what they're pushing back against and how they're actually working with some of that? So when I think about internalized depression, okay, it's sort of where I want to help somebody go and think about options. There's always some danger in terms of disrupting the cultural, yes, right? But is there also some potential value saying these things aren't necessarily fixed, and there are people who are navigating, a book that you would give a group, a women's book club.
Well, if it was my identity, yes. Like if I were, and I do this like all the time. Right.
That's why I'm asking.
Right. But if I'm a physician and I'm seeing people whose identities I couldn't give them inside information, what I would probably do is validate the fact that they are experiencing they're experiencing shifting expectations and how difficult that must be, and then trying to work with them to find solutions. Like not saying I know the answer and here it is. So I think that there's almost two answers. Like that's why it was so interesting to work in this team, because we had such different relationships to the material. And so the things that Elsa could say would be super specific, and there are things that you would say like from your own experience and things like that, and then stuff that I might pull away is like, well, what can I learn from that from a larger perspective? What could I share? I wouldn't feel like after 75 minutes I could say I could provide any. I would feel very. It would come off as really disingenuous.
Well, but you could speak from your experience as somebody who works with disability culture, right?
I think that what I would get frustrated with is one of the things that pisses me off the very most in medical encounters is the doctors thinking they know what disability experience is. Right. So I wouldn't want to replicate that with someone with a different identity and saying, oh, I know something about this. What I want doctors to do when I go in is to listen for what they don't understand. And I was just talking with a friend of mine, and we were talking about therapy and mental health, and she was saying how she's currently in her therapist working through some issues where she was trying to process a conflict she had within disability community. And part of disability community values is interdependence and the kind of things that she and this other disabled person were doing for one another to try to survive. And the therapist kept saying that she was codependent and offering her text to read about codependency. And she said, I felt so misunderstood. She's like, that was not the mental health problem. This is what we have to do to survive. Right. So when she was saying that to me, I was like, oh, this reminds me kind of what's going on here. Yeah, exactly. So the transferable thing would be about even just having an awareness that there's something else going on here that I don't understand. Maybe we can draw that out through your narrative of your lived. I want to hear your lived experience. And now tell me about that. This seems like shifting things and not, maybe that's cultural humility. I don't know, because I've never studied that framework, but that's what, as a patient, that's what I want. I want it's like that when I was talking with one of my students, because I'm using my wheelchair more, so I'm getting a ton of new experiences with people who aren't used to seeing me use my wheelchair. And so one of my students who's studying to be a physical therapist was, he was in my office, and of course he wanted to talk about, well, how do these movies that were in class, how do they relate to experience? And so we were talking about characters who use wheelchairs. And the thing that he kept coming back to was these stereotypes that are in the films about using wheelchairs. And I said, well, do they ever tell you in physical therapy school how much fun it is to use a wheelchair? You know, I'm experiencing, like when we met at Student Center West, I've never even been in a whole wing of Student Center West because it was too far for me to walk. And I went to, I was like, wow, I didn't know all these restaurants were here. Wait, there's a bowling alley? I smell a pool. You can get to the pool from there to here. Like I'm going all these places I can do, and he had no concept of that. Right. So it's this kind of mismatch between, as I was trying to tell him, look, when you become a physical therapist, if you convey and you don't listen to like what the actual thing is that the person's experiencing, you're not creating something that will actually help the patient. So this is to me like, again, like how are we taking what is generalizable that we can look from context? And I found all this information super interesting and valuable. I do feel like I know a lot more, but not enough to counsel a patient.
Yeah.
Or a student.
That's not what the portrait is.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
So it's not counseling, but I think what Carrie just demonstrated there is what I'm actually looking for as a tangible tool that the student can take away. So to be able to say what I'm hearing you say is, or perhaps there's, some ambiguous feelings, or just to be able to have something there that frames the encounter is not fixed.
Well, basically to be able to, like Sandy did earlier, to be able to interpret the experiences that she'd had with Nati when she's had ants in her hands, and to realize that now she can interpret it through this lens and say, oh, it's not that she just can't sit still, it's that she's from a culture in which sitting still means you're lazy and a problem. I mean, now there's like a different, so as we listen as physicians listen to patients, now they have a different cultural lens to understand their patients through. I mean, I think to me that's what's really helpful about this, is that by hearing these voices and hearing how they're doing impression management around fitting in these cultural lenses, for those of us who are outside of the culture, who aren't part of this group, we've learned more about the cultural norms that are associated with it, and we're also seeing how people contradict it and fight it and disrupt it. And I think it's also, probably for those who are within it, really helpful to see other people's performance of these cultural norms, differences. It's always really useful for a member, I know for me as a member of a group, to see other people's performance that looks different than mine, et cetera. So I think that's what's really useful here, is for people to be able to say, when I read this, now I learned how to interpret patients' words better, like to understand when they're talking what these kinds of things mean. But to me, that's part of what's helpful, and to give them more understanding so that they can be more culturally helpful.
I want to say thank you for saying that, because I feel that I'm a Hispanic female who's always been the only one in the group, just having other people who really wants to learn more about the cultures and my upbringing and what really means to be Hispanic is actually very meaningful and powerful. Yeah. Because not everybody's interested in really knowing who we are and where we come from. So I feel giving it into that context and giving into not everybody's going to experience this type of upbringing, and they might be a little more open to a less machismo, less defined roles and more connection. But at the same time, just having that there is actually super powerful. The other, there's a book, I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter. Oh, right. It is a very, very, very good read about, and it's based in Chicago. It's Mexican family. They deal with immigration, mental health problems, religion, and family dynamics and isolation in this city. So highly, highly recommend.
Is it fiction?
It's fiction.
Oh, I was gonna say,
But
that
it's-
sounds like it's perfect.
But it's told in a fictional first person narrative.
Yes, it's fictional.
I don't,
Yeah.
yeah.
I say next chapter.
And we found it like the last. we didn't
Because I know we asked about that. Could have,
So,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. So I think again, if you ask this question, how are you navigating? If that's the central question, then you can get at all of this other stuff. I would also think, I don't know if you want to do this, but maybe just take mental health out of it. I mean, and because it can lead to a pathologization. And that's not really, I think, what you're trying to do. I think what you're trying to do is show the pressures of a gendered script. Whether or not it's like you end up depressed or whatever, I'm not sure I don't know, but I'm not sure you actually need that to explore these layers, these really complex layers. And then the other thing I would go back to what Allie said earlier is just think about, what is the social issue? What is the social thing you want to get at, right? So if it's, gendered identity or something like that, then, focus that and then put all the layers on that.
I'll defer to Joanna on this because she did the interviews, but I thought that the whole fact that she was asking about mental health and that they had to kind of struggle through the early sections are painful because they're like, the words aren't the same, but that's what brought out these gendered scripts, was talking about something like specifically, how do you think about mental health and well-being, was how we got to gender. So I'm a little worried about saying, get rid of mental health as a focus of this, because it was a way into understanding a specific gendered performance.
Okay, point well taken. Totally.
I wonder if it's useful to think about the difference between the social theme or the social problem, and then like or maybe the social problem versus the themes that are raised. Like,
yeah.
I was thinking about this in relationship to the discussion of religion. Like, religion is a theme, but the ways that religion gets read on and manifested in kind of a specific kind of script is a social problem. So I don't know, somehow, I don't know the answer to this, but I think that maybe parsing through the social problem and then the themes that are related to that problem might help you retain both things while still kind of getting a little bit more focus. Because I think what I'm hearing through the whole conversation is just the need to focus so that as a student, you know what to do with all the material. If that makes sense.
So you're not seeing this, Allie, but I'm seeing currently I agree, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'm looking at a slide right now that says barriers to mental health care, which seems like a social issue that's being addressed. Barriers to mental health care in the Hispanic community, right? Like that seems like a social issue we could be addressing. And I think what we could the sort of implied thing after this is all of this stuff is true, cultural stigma and all this other stuff. And the other thing we're going to talk about today is how gendered and cultural scripts are an additional barrier to mental health care, right? And I think if you did that, how gendered and cultural scripts produce many of these things, because in fact, privacy concerns, this don't air your dirty laundry in public seems related to machismo and Marianismo codes. That's how you described it, right?
Yeah,
that was in the
when you talk about chismosa.
Exactly, that was in here.
Yeah,
so I think if you talked about it that way, that might really pull everything together. And I think that's a really lovely way to address what because I think that to me it seems like a social problem. We were talking about this in the hall earlier, that it's interesting that there are several groups that are under, that have received less access to mental health care. And one of the groups is Black men, and Jonathan Metzl has done work on that, right? This is another group, right? And so I think it's great to explore this.
Yeah, and then if we use the contextualization that Michael was talking about to explain how the interviews happened. So if we told the story that you were asking about mental health and we got to gender,
Exactly. That's
then that
boom. It just goes right
then
into
it goes right
Yeah, it's
into it.
almost like this underlying layer that's being missed in a lot of these larger contexts of mental health is what about the gendered aspect of a woman, and then these other things that how is religion, how is a woman, for the good and the bad, how is religion a piece of that gendering, and then how is the U.S. transition changing the role of woman, and so it's these,
and then you can unpack the distance from I think there's a lot of research that's shown that the further you are from immigration, the less likely you are to be very affected by machismo culture. Not always, but sometimes, it depends on where you live and how much of a enclave you live in and stuff, stuff like that. Like, it's not always true, but it could be true. It's not always true, right? But it could be true, right? So, but these are things you can explore, right? Like, and talk through, like, is that true? Is that not true? How does that work? And you can unpack that, I think.
One thing we didn't get to that was in the Maria paradox, and I kind of put it as an asterisk, was where's that slide about the slide about the Marianne Wiesma and this one. So I put in the asterisk that what are the light and dark sides of these roles, because that comes up in the book. And I thought that we were just talking about all these in a negative way. And then when you were talking about machismo, you brought up the other. Right. So I thought if we could bring that in and not make these all negative, because there are also opportunities that these roles, because one thing about the Goffman is that the roles give us our identity, that they give us a way to understand our place in the world. And if we say that all these things are only negative, it's kind of disempowering, because these women are using them as a form of agency. And if they were only all bad, I mean, then look at the kind of power these women have that came out in these healing circles. And if they're the ones who showed up, if it was open to men and women and they showed up, that means their feeling of responsibility for their families meant they showed up for that conversation, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like we need to tweak that to bring out both.
There's actually other parts of the area that we didn't show that is like a woman is saying, like, my husband is actually very supportive of me. It's actually the in-laws that give me pressure and make me feel like I'm not being a good wife. And so, we might be able to, there's these other, it's a whole nother, and so I felt like too that we were a little bit missing that piece of, because she was giving like, well, my husband actually defends me and supports me, even though he thinks I'm still really the main caretaker of the kids. So like how she said, like, he kind of is, but then at the same time, when it works for him, it's still my responsibility. So there's that dynamic. So I want to make sure that we can include these other, like, it's not all husbands are going to be, because I struggle a lot with this too, because year after year, I talk about evil eye, I talk about empacho, I talk about these things that I'm like the insider outsider, I like feel very, it's just like strong cultural roots, but I'm still white. And so I struggle with, like, people say, oh, that's cultural comedy, that's stereotyping. But I'm like, but if you don't talk about it, then people won't know that you really think that you have empacho, not that you have this or that. So it's this struggle that I have with this, like, I feel so ingrained in it that I can speak about it, but I don't have that lens of how it's perceived from the outside. I'm like, I'm not stereotyping because I get it. I've had enough time there, but then how do you avoid, like, huh? Oh, empacho is this idea that you digest something that actually blocks your intestinal tract, and it can be gum or too much tortilla or bread or something, and it gets lodged in there and it causes digestive upset. And so they'll go to a masseuse that pulls on along your spine. And students have told me, I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years, and still students that are 20 are saying, oh yeah, my mom took me. And I was like, what the hell is this? And like, and it makes this loud popping sound when you release. and it pops really loud, and then you give some teas and things to move that, whatever that blockage is, out. And so, I mean, there's a lot of things like that they would not go to a doctor for that. They would go to a masseuse, they would get the pole, they would do the thing, and
Give me a referral.
My babysitter, she does the massage to my kids, and actually it's a stomach massage. She does it differently, so it's a stomach massage with some oils, some prayers, and that's how the stomach pains are relieved in my house.
Same with Joseph, my son. My nanny does all the teas and all the massages.
And it was like, that's the stuff that like I live for, but it was very, I mean, I almost like, I couldn't leave out the curandero and everything because I know it's so ingrained, but we really don't get into it almost barely at all in this. And so, and I almost tend to disagree with Elsa a little bit, that I don't think these are all interwoven as strongly with religion. Like I don't, you can believe in empacho and a lot of teas and things, and I think the culture is ingrained in Catholicism, but a lot of these practices would stand on their own out there. And so I see too, like in the conversation, she's talking about the priest and the curandero and the what. These are all, and we actually talked about relabeling it as other things that people do that include religion, that include teas, that include, because a curandero in Catholicism may layer and might not. And so I felt like it was getting a little bit in the dialogue, it was almost getting put together because they try all these things. And so I don't know if that needs to.
There's also prayers behind them. You have to be trained, and there's some prayers that goes in your mind. But the prayers, they can only be transmitted to be fruitful, and there's a lot of mystery.
But the prayer in a Catholic church is very different than a prayer
Oh
that
yeah,
a priest does.
It's informal religion.
It's informal religion.
So we need to kind of, I feel like we need to describe.
Call it cultural scripts, you're done.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, guys.